Well, hey there, First Church. What an unprecedented and different weekend that we're having today. I am so glad to be joining you together. And, it's so amazing to me how much we take things for granted. But as soon as we lose the ability to gather together in person, I'm reminded of how grateful I am that God lets us come together with the freedom of assembly in this country. And I'm grateful for our freedom of religion. And this Sunday, what a reminder that we have that that's a gift that God has given to us. But I'm excited to be continuing our second week of our 1 Minute After You Die series. And the title kind of explains everything in this series. We're going to spend the next half hour talking about heaven and hell. And if you missed last week, we talked about the judgment that determines where you go after death, but before you go to either place. This week, we're talking about what heaven and hell are actually like. And I'm excited about this message. And again, I want to thank you for joining us. Now, the coronavirus stuff has been kind of crazy. From crazy stock market crashes and a plummeting economic outlook to the real and present fear of getting sick. What an interesting thing it is to me to think about all the different information we've heard about the coronavirus. From it's as serious as a heart attack to it's no big deal, it's just fake news from one political party to another. It's amazing to me how broad the reactions have been. Now, my family is extremely focused on facts, like big time. And whenever my dad and brother and I get together, my wife is always like, you guys have the worst conversations, like the most boring conversations on earth, which is kind of true. One of our favorite things to talk about is the latest tax filing strategies. That's like something we love. Christians always like, Jesus, please come back before a family reunion. Please come back right now, like I need you. But anyway, we are for sure into facts and figures. And when this coronavirus thing really started gathering steam in January, my dad did a whole bunch of research like he does, and he noted several things. First off, he noted that the flu for people under 20 is many times more deadly than the coronavirus. He also noted that for people 50 and under, the threat is very small. But he did say, hey, for people 60 and over, the danger is real. And he noted that the infection rate was probably way underreported. Only the most severe cases are tested. We have a severe shortage of testing kits in America, which would inflate the death rate substantially. Given the shortage of testing kits that we have, the death rate is still only about 3%, but it's very likely much lower than that, probably lower than 1%, which the New York Times and President Trump both noted this last week, which is kind of interesting because that's like opposite ends of the political spectrum. But anyway, that would place it closer to the vicinity of the flu, still far more dangerous. But this is not like a Mad Max pandemic, okay? You don't need to go to Costco and buy all the toilet paper. We're going to be okay. But my brother noted after this, after my dad sent that first email, that China actually has a much higher rate of smokers and that their air pollution is much worse, causing a lot of people to have lung damage. And since the primary issues associated with coronavirus are respiratory inflated, the Chinese death rate is probably even more inflated. Several weeks ago, my dad predicted that the economic fallout from society's harsh response to the coronavirus would probably have an equal level of suffering in and of itself, in addition to the virus. And this is not to say that we should avoid taking precautions like, in flu season. Elderly people and particularly people with underlying health issues should be very cautious. But we should also know the facts, and we should react proportionately and reasonably. And I think a lot of the sensation and panic and lack of panic and, overemphasizing it and underemphasizing it has already caused a lot of pain and hurt, as well as stress and worry. And here's the truth. I was really worried until my dad and brother took the time to write those emails. Specifically, I was worried because I didn't have and I didn't know information. A lot of the information that I did have was exaggerated by news media or poorly interpreted by news media or built around a narrative somebody was trying to create. I think the same issue exists around heaven and hell and life after death. We worry about it a lot because we haven't looked into it that much. We hear rumors, we hear thoughts, we hear people giving a spin about it, but when we actually look into it, like when I looked into coronavirus, I think we're going to gain a good deal of information about it. And the information that we get corroborates with scientific studies done on people who have near-death experiences. And while, listen, heaven and hell are serious and they're real, there are actions that we can take to make it less scary. I think information is power. I think when you free data, we free our minds to make good actions. In my first few minutes about reading about coronavirus, I'm going to tell you, they weren't fun. It wasn't pleasurable. But I felt a lot more peace after the fact because I understood what was at stake. And I felt confident in the actions that we were able to take as a church and as individuals. And I believe that as we talk about heaven and hell, much of the fear, the concern, or the lack of concern that we have will be addressed with reality so that we can make proportionate action, so that we can have purpose, passion, peace, and meaning. That's what I hope today's message does. And this message is pretty simple. I'm going to make some points on hell. I'm going to make some points on heaven. And then I'm going to make a closing point. And I'm just going to be honest. My points about heaven and my closing point are going to be things you're really going to like. The hell part, it's hard, but it's good to learn about. That's it. Let's pray, and we'll get started. Jesus, I invite you into this place. I thank you that even though we're enduring a pandemic, your word and your promises will prevail. I thank you that you give us a peace even as we face trials and temptations and troubles. I lift up our country, our world, our community to you, God. I pray that through all of this, your gospel would reign. I pray that for everybody who follows you, you give us a peace that surpasses understanding. And I pray that through this pandemic, people would learn to see who you are, what you've done for us, and that they choose to follow you. In the name of Jesus, all God's people said, amen. Let's start by talking about some points on hell. Now, I think that hell is a real thing, and it's startling and shocking for a lot of people. I don't know if you know this, but the Romans were astounded by the cruelty of the Christian concept of hell. Eternal suffering and damnation was unheard of and harsh to them. Many liberal theologians today tend to try to explain hell away. And 74% of Americans believe in heaven, but only 40% of Americans believe in hell. Most would say that hell is reserved for only the very worst people, yet Jesus teaches about it differently. This is kind of interesting. Jesus himself talked more about hell than any other person in the Bible. It was his second most preached about topic. And about hell, in Matthew 7:13, Jesus says, you can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. The highway to hell is broad, and its gate is wide for the many who choose that way. But the gateway to life is very narrow, and the road is difficult, and only a few will find it. Some have tried to explain this, but the point on hell here that Jesus is making is that hell is a real place that many people will go to, and it's really bad. And listen, if you believe in Jesus, this is a point that you accept. If you say, man, I believe in Jesus, but I don't believe in hell, that's an oxymoron. Like, this is part of following Jesus. Now, interestingly enough, hell is corroborated by a lot of near-death experiences. And many people say, oh, you had a near-death experience? That means you saw heaven. Not always true. There's a lot of people who actually experience a hellish afterlife before being revived from a near-death experience with horrible descriptions of what they experienced. It actually seems to corroborate what Jesus describes in the Bible. So hell is a real place. There's no doubt about that. But many people ask, why would hell even exist? Like, what's the point of that? I believe that hell exists so that heaven can exist. If evil is banished from heaven and sent away, it must have a place to be banished to. That place is called hell. Now, I often hear people who say, well, hell should only be for the truly worst of the worst, or it shouldn't exist at all. A lot of times I see those same people scream for harsh judgment on others who simply disagree with their perspectives. I've seen an increasing group on the far, far left and some on the far, far right who also say that anyone who disagrees with them is committing hate speech and they should be judged and punished because they've triggered me, demanding justice and reparation be made for anything that they perceive as wrong, while demanding clemency, freedom, and license for everything that they want to do. Ultimately, I don't think people have a problem with hell existing. I think a lot of people have a problem with God, with them not being God over heaven and hell. Hell also exists because people have rejected God. God does not demand that people follow him. Otherwise, he could have just made a bunch of robots, right? He doesn't demand it. When people reject God in his life, he says, fine. And he allows them to go to a place where he is not. 2 Thessalonians 1:8 says, in a flaming fire, bringing judgment on those who don't know God and those who refuse to obey the good news of our Lord Jesus, they will be punished with eternal destruction, forever separated from the Lord and from his glorious power. I know that's harsh, but the key here that I want you to see is forever separated from the Lord. The ESV says, taken away from the presence of the Lord. Hell is a place where people who reject God can have what they want, a place without God. Ultimately, I think that hell exists because people reject God's presence, power, and authority. Now, people have asked me, what is hell like? Hell at its core is a place where God has turned his back on people because they have turned their backs on God. It is a place, the one place in all creation, where God's nature of love and grace is no longer present. Some people argue with that definition, but I think most scholars would agree that God's love and grace are not present in hell. When God is ignored physically on earth, I think a lot of times it results in a worse level of life satisfaction on earth. We see this. As people abandon the teachings of Jesus, we see a lower level of life satisfaction. I would argue that when people don't follow Jesus and they push him out of their life, earth becomes a more hellish place. As people begin to ignore God more, earth becomes a place that is less great to live because the absence of God is a reflection of hell itself. Some of my favorite examples of this are like Justin Bieber and Kanye West. Here you have two great guys by earthly standards who did some amazing things, but they lived in debauchery, right? They lived far, far, far from the teaching of Jesus. And both of them, before they were followers of Christ, would say, man, my life was really rough. Like, things were not good. Like, even though I had everything you could ever want, life wasn't good, right? But after following Jesus, it's really cool to see them say, man, like, following Jesus' teachings led to higher levels of life satisfaction, more joy. On a spiritual level, when God is ignored, the result is described as fiery destruction, unsated hatred, and suffering inflicted between spiteful beings. It will not be like a heavy metal concert. Hell won't be. It will be a lonely, desolate place of suffering. Have you ever been in a group of people where everybody just hated each other, at a job where everybody just hated each other? I think that is, hell is far worse than that, but I think that's a lot of what hell is. It's a selfishness unbridled from God's presence, played out as supernatural suffering and spite forever. The bottom line is, when people rebel against God and abandon God, the result is not nice. The world is made to be a worse place. If everyone chose utter sin, even if you're an atheist, I know you'd agree with this, if everybody on earth chose to abandon the Judeo-Christian ethic, man, the earth would be a much worse place. It would be a hellish existence. Indeed, despite our great wealth, we're far less happy in America in this generation, I think, because we have chosen to push God out of our generation. When God allows people to be truly absent from His presence on a spiritual level without any of His love to temper it, the result is hellish indeed. I don't think that fire in hell is a metaphor. I think that in the spiritual realm, hell will be spiritual suffering that never ends. It is the worst thing that we can imagine, but worse. There are many near-death experiences that have corroborated this. And here is the bottom line. Hell is a real place that people go to, and it's worse than we can imagine. Now, a lot of people ask, okay, so what's the point of this? Like, that sounds really bad. How should we live if hell is real? Listen, if I was a devil, you know what my strategy would be? It would be to get people to think that heaven was boring and hell was not real. I think that would be a great way to cause people to not really live a Christian life, you know? And it's hard to convince people that God doesn't exist. We're not superstitious, right? We don't follow the religion of atheism. That's a silly, silly, superstitious religion. We can't ignore facts. We know that something doesn't come from nothing. I think the harder part is not to think that God doesn't exist, or it's hard to convince us that God doesn't exist, but I think it's easy to get us to ignore the implications of hell being real and heaven being real. I think that's a devil's strategy, and I think it's a really good strategy. Which brings me to the next part of this message. I want to talk about heaven for a moment. And my first point on heaven is pretty simple. Heaven is a real place that is better than we can imagine. I think a lot of people assume that heaven's going to be boring, but it won't be. It's a real place that is amazing and awesome. Revelation 4:2 talks about it. It says, and instantly I was in the Spirit, and I saw a throne in heaven and someone sitting on it. The one sitting on the throne was brilliant like gemstones, like jasper and carnelian, and the glow of an emerald encircled the throne like a rainbow. From the throne came flashes of lightning and the rumble of thunder, and in front of the throne was a shiny sea of glass sparkling like crystal. Now, I skipped some parts in there, but listen. I remember as a kid, my Sunday school teachers being like, do you want to hear what heaven's going to be like? And I'd be like, yeah, tell me, I want to hear, right? And then they'd read that passage, and I'd try to sit there, and they'd be like, ta-da! And I'd be like, that sounds like terrible. That sounds like really boring. You know what I mean? Like, don't get me wrong. The thunder's cool for 5 minutes. They'd be like, yeah, we'll be there forever for 10,000 years. I'm like, don't get me wrong. The Grand Canyon's beautiful. I could stare at it for, I don't know, maybe a whole year looking at the Grand Canyon, taking in the view. But after a year of looking at the Grand Canyon, I'm going to be like, okay, I'm good. I got it. Not that great, And then they go on. My Sunday school teachers would go on. They'd say, in the center around the throne were 4 living beings, each covered with eyes, front and back. And the first of these living beings was like a lion. The second was like an ox. The third had a human face. And the fourth was like an eagle in flight. Each of these living beings had 6 wings, and their wings were covered all over with eyes, inside and out. And day after day and night after night, they keep on saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty, the one who always was, who is, and who is still to come. At this point, I'm like, well, heaven just got weird. It's boring and weird. It goes on to say they shouted day after day and night after night, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, who was and is still to come. And you know what? That's just a lot of repetition. Don't get me wrong. Those beings they seem terrifying, frankly. I don't know, lots of eyes. Seems like something out of a bad movie. And 15-year-old me, I was like, well, I don't want to go to hell, but I also don't want to go to heaven. That's what I just thought. That's what I was thinking, if I'm being honest. But then when I was 15 or 16, I heard a pastor say something that just kind of changed my life. It was a really, really big deal. He told me about something called 2D world. And I shared this with the church before a long time ago, about 5.5 years ago, but I want to share this with you guys again. I brought in a picture of what I like to call 2D world. 2D world is flat. You'll notice this is flat. There's no depth to it. You can go up and down and back and forth, right? And let's just pretend this is a world that people live in. And I want to introduce you to two of my friends in 2D world, okay? This guy's name, we're going to call him John right here, okay? And John's a super, super nice guy. Everybody loves John, okay? And now this girl's here. Her name is going to be Kristen. She is a babe. Look at her, okay? Everybody loves her too. She's super sweet. Everybody loves her. Let's give her some hair, okay? I gave her also a little dot on her forehead. There we go. All better, okay? John and Kristen, J and K. They're chilling in 2D world, right? It's a nice place to live. Everything's flat. They can't see in 3D. They've never been to 3D. Now, I want you to imagine for a second this ball with me. They can't see this ball because this ball is in 3D world. They can't see it. It's got 3 dimensions. It's got depth. They can't see the ball. Now, imagine with me for a second, what if I pass this ball through their world? You know what I mean? Like, somehow I pass the ball through their world. I put it, like, imagine if I could put it through the plane of this paper, what would they see? Since they only see in 2D, the first thing they'd see when the ball hits the paper is a dot, right? And then, as the ball began to pass through the plane of their world, I got to get stronger here. As the ball began to pass through the plane of their world, they would see a dot and then a circle that got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it was the full circumference of this ball right here, right? And then as the ball began to pass through the back half of the ball began to go through their world, the circle would get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they just saw another dot again as the back part of the ball left the plane of their world. That's what they would see. And, it's interesting to me because, John would say to Kristen, or Kristen would say to John, John, did you see that? And John would be like, yeah, I saw it, man. It was a dot, and it was a circle that got bigger and bigger and bigger and smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it was a dot. And Kristen would be like, yeah, well, I saw that too, but, you ever thought, what if it was more than that? John would be like, don't be silly. I don't get into faith and stuff. I don't get into that stuff. And Kristen would be like, well, it's not faith. It's just inquisition. I have a legitimate question. Something has to have caused that, right? What do you think caused it? What if there's, more out there, What if I put my fingers through their world? If I put my hand into their world, what would they see? Well, first they'd see 5 little dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as the tips of my finger began to pierce their world. And then they'd see, 5 little Asian circles, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Cute little Asian circles. Those are big. Those are like Dutch circles. But anyway, Asian circles, and then as I pull my hand back out, what would they see? They'd see 5 little dots, leaving their world. And they'd have the same conversation. Kristen would say to John, John, did you see that? And John would be like, yeah, I saw that. And Chris would be like, yeah, it was cool. What do you think it was? John would say, well, it's obvious. It was 5 dots. You know what I mean? Then 5 little Asian circles, and then 5 dots again. And Kristen would say, have you ever thought there was more? John would be like, I don't get into faith and stuff. Kristen would say, it's not faith. It's inquisition. What do you think caused it? Right? Now, what if I hovered my hand right by Kristen's face? Right? Kristen would say, man, John, have you ever wondered if there was ever more out there? And John would be like, no, I haven't. What I see is what it is. Right? Chris would be like, sometimes I just feel like there's a hand next to me, like the hand of a greater being is next to me. What if I picked gently Kristen up and I set her on my table right here and I showed her my ball? I set it down, What if Kristen got to look at that ball and she saw it for the first time? What would happen? Well, she would be overwhelmed. She had seen things her whole life, but she'd never seen anything in 3D. And her language, her spatial relations wouldn't even be adequate to see. She couldn't even tell what it was. It would blow her mind. It takes babies years to develop spatial relations. Kristen would see it, and her mind would be blown even if I showed it to her for 20 minutes. She's like, oh, she would be weeping. She would fall on her face. She'd be overwhelmed. She would look at the ball and worship and say, holy, holy, holy is the ball almighty. Oh, my goodness. Her mind would be blown. Then if I pick her up and I put her back into this world, what's she going to do? Kristen would say to John, John, I saw it. I'd be like, what'd you see, girl? You tell me what you saw. She'd say, I saw the dot in the circles. I saw the dot in the circles. John would say, yeah, well, what do you mean? I saw that too. It was cool. It was a dot, it was circles, got bigger, smaller. She'd say, no. I saw it in its entirety. I saw all of it. John would say, really? Okay, well, describe it to me. And Kristen would try to describe it, but her language, her comprehension, her world does not accommodate a third dimension. They don't have depth. They don't have volume. They don't have the word sphere. They don't have the word ball. So Kristen's like, ugh. It was like a dot with circles, but like many infinite circles going around, circling. And John would say, dude, that's what I saw too, a dot with a circle going around it. You sound like a religious kook, Kristen. It's an experience that she's trying to describe, but her world just can't comprehend it. Along the same line, there's another thing that I've seen recently. There are these glasses that can help someone who's colorblind see. And being colorblind is not that big of a deal. As far as like life disabilities, it's not that big a deal. 60% of men, the majority of men are colorblind on some level. A lot of men are colorblind and don't even know it. That's why we dress so poorly. That's why we need our wives to help coordinate our clothing. But anyway, I had a short video put together because there's a lot of men now who are putting on these glasses, and they're seeing real color for the first time. And their reactions are priceless. You're going to see some men seeing color and weeping. Go ahead and play that video.
No.
Come on.
Come on. Are you serious?
Yeah.
Yeah, these are special glasses. You're cute like that. Is this actually what it looks like? It's so clear, I can't believe it.
I mean, they didn't even have the words to describe it. Their language has the words. Obviously, English has words to describe color, but they were overwhelmed by this little tiny thing. You know what I mean? Like color in the grand scheme of things, but the beauty, the vividness was overwhelming. And again, it's not that big of a change. All things considered, all they were doing was adding color to a world that they already saw. Not just all colors, some colors. It's hard to describe to someone who's never seen color what it's like. I think most people assume that it's not that big a deal, and it isn't. Yet even that tiny bit of existence changing was so overwhelming to them that they wept. And this is a common reaction. I want to ask you, how much more do you think you will react to the otherworldly, overwhelming beauty of heaven or horrors of hell? Our friends from 2D World, John and Kristen saw a more drastic change. Obviously, we can see that it would be shocking and overwhelming. Both colorblinded people and John and Kristen had a difficult time describing what they had seen. You know what's interesting to me is when you read about near-death experiences, everybody comes back with a great difficulty describing their experience. They're like, oh, it was amazing. Well, tell me about it. I can't, right? Because they're seeing something unique. Now, Paul probably had a near-death experience. We can get into that, but about his near-death experience in 1 Corinthians 2:9, he writes, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. He's saying, look, guys, our language, our experience on earth is completely insufficient. It doesn't have the capacity to describe what was seen. It's otherworldly. There's more dimensions that God lives in. It's like Kristen trying to describe the ball, right? I mean, she can. It's like it's the dot. It's like a circle with a lot of dots. I mean, how do you describe a 3D ball from a 2D world? John, Jesus' best friend, wrote that passage we read, Revelation chapter 4. Remember what he said? It says, and instantly I was in the Spirit, and I saw a throne in heaven, and someone sitting on it. The one sitting on the throne was brilliant as gemstones, like jasper and carnelian. The glow of an emerald encircled his throne like a rainbow. Listen, John lives in the Greco-Roman world of antiquity, right? Even though he was somewhat cultured and probably had experienced some things relatively for his age. I mean, the Greco-Roman world of antiquity was not a wonderful place to live. He didn't see like a ton of beautiful things. So what does he do? He just describes the most beautiful thing that he's ever seen, right? He sees it. He's like, whoa, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, like gemstones, jasper, carnelian, rainbows. Does that mean that that's actually what God looked like? Well, probably not. Probably not. I'm not saying that it's inaccurate. It's just I'm saying our language is insufficient to describe what the next life will be. All of these people getting a glimpse of the new are wrecked and moved and amazed. We know that heaven won't just be a more vivid color palette. We know heaven is going to be far more significant than someone going from a 2D world to a 3D world. Heaven will literally be outside of our time, infinitely better. I think this is why the descriptions of the Bible are confusing to us. We lack the words and the capacity to understand them. Our minds at this point literally cannot conceive of them. So to us, like John in 2D world, it seems odd. It seems unbelievable, right? He's sitting there, he's like, well, that seems odd. That seems unbelievable. And it's not odd. It's not boring. It's different. And this is why my favorite descriptions in the Bible of what heaven will be like focus less on what it looks like and more on the feelings it produces in our life. It says, I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, look, God's home is now among his people, and he will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them, and he will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, sorrow, crying, or pain. All these things are gone forever. God's presence in our lives will remove completely pain and sorrow, and it will give us hope and joy. I heard one person say it will be like rolling on E, but infinitely better. It will last forever in an infinite world. It will be so much better. You know what's interesting is we have no concept of infinite. We live in a finite world. Nothing is infinite. I mean, joy is fleeting. Amusement is fleeting. Last summer, we were at Indiana Beach. May it rest in peace. But we were at Indiana Beach, my daughter and I, and we were going on this roller coaster. There was no lines. And the ride people were like, hey, do you want to go around again? And I was like, yeah, the first time it was amazing. The second time I was like, oh, that's okay. The third time they're like, do you want to go around again? I was like, My daughter was like, yeah. So we went around again. I was like, that was terrible. Why? Because amusement is fleeting. Pleasure is fleeting. We think about the most pleasurable things in this life, right? I mean, it's all right. It's great. I mean, it's good for a little bit. Meaning is fleeting. I think about the most meaningful experiences in my life. They were good for a time, but they become meaningless. In heaven, there are things that can be infinitely joyful. You know, we think about worshiping God for all eternity. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. I mean, for us, that sounds terrible, but think about this. There are things in heaven that will be infinitely joyful. Like they will never, ever, ever get old. Infinitely amusing, infinitely pleasureful. Like that's kind of cool to think like we could have pleasure all the time, like infinitely meaningful and never, ever loses its meaning. We never get bored. Now, we have no concept of this because we don't live in an infinite world, and yet this is something that can happen in heaven, and they're trying to describe it, but it's difficult to describe. In heaven, we'll always have meaning. We'll never be lonely. We'll never be unknown. It's so much more than like a family reunion at a barbecue. You know, I know a lot of people are like, heaven is going to be like a family reunion. I'm going to see all my friends and family. It's like, I've had some pretty hellish family reunions in my life. But no, it's not heaven because there's people that we love there. It's heaven because God is there. He is the source and joy of all things. If heaven to you is about a family reunion, you're totally missing the point. Jesus is what heaven is about. He is the source and reason for all things. And we should long for heaven because we long for Jesus. For without him, it wouldn't be heaven. If Jesus isn't present in heaven, heaven would be hell. I think that is why we see a shadow of this in this life. As Christians, we suffer in this life, there's no doubt. But Christians are the most joy-filled, hope-filled, and life-satisfied group of people, subgroup of people on earth. As a matter of statistical fact. I know that like sometimes we're unhappy, sometimes we have hard things. But because God's Spirit is with us, though it is not the full manifestation of God's presence yet in this life, I think that God gives us a joy in this life that is deep and real. My favorite book on heaven is called Imagine Heaven. It's by John Berkey, and it's a book that took tens of thousands of near-death experiences, and it researched them in a methodical manner, and it paints a picture of what heaven and hell will be like. It happens to correspond really well with the Bible, and I've done a sermon on this that we're going to link in the description to this talk, and this book it's available in the shop if you want to stop by the church and get it. But today, I want to focus on this core concept that no matter how hard we try to theorize about heaven, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love him. Our attempts to bring a clearer resolution to heaven are always going to be tough because our minds and our language simply cannot contain God's glory. Here's what we know for sure, is that heaven will be unimaginably good, better than our wildest dreams. We will be more moved with joy, pleasure, and emotion than we could possibly imagine because Jesus will be there with us. Similarly, hell will be unimaginably terrible. That is what I hope you take out of this talk. Now, I have one closing thought that I want to give to you. I think the reason that God seems so offensive to so many of us is because we don't understand that he is outside of time and in eternity. This is a big concept to understand about both hell and heaven. Many times people ask me, why does God take sin seriously? I think God takes sin seriously, like hell and heaven seriously, because he exists outside of our time. Like, he is not watching this moment right now. God exists outside of the linear progression, one-dimensional forward progression of time. He sees time like a completed picture, all of it at once. Right now, God is creating the world, dying on the cross, and returning in victory all at once. For him, time is experienced differently. And people say this all the time in a near-death experience. They're like, I can't describe it. It was super short. It was super long. Because they exist outside of time. It's experienced differently. It's like Kristen trying to describe a ball to John. It's so hard. God doesn't just see us sinning. This is why he takes sin seriously. I remember the sin I'm most embarrassed about in my life is some nasty words that I said to this boy named Jeff Keenan in 6th grade. And to this day, I still think, man, that was hard. I remember saying those words, and here's the thing about that. This is why God takes sin seriously. God sees the way those words hurt Jeff in that moment, but he also sees the way that sin hurts us in the future. He sees the way that my hurtful words corrupted and shaped who Jeff would become. He sees how my words would damage Jeff's self-image. He sees how my words led Jeff down paths of self-destruction and how my one sin led Jeff to sin against himself and others. He sees how my hurtful words didn't just hurt people around Jeff, but how it also hurt Jeff's family and children and children's children, how one choice that I made in 6th grade would hurt many generations. You see, it's not just a few things, a few hurtful words uttered by an angry 6th grader. They are words that echo in eternity, uttered from one eternal being to another eternal being. Now, by God's grace, my sin is forgiven. But we see why Jesus takes sin seriously, why he died for it. In the clarity of God's all-knowing vision, God sees sin for what it is. It's something that destroys and tears down and eliminates good. It's something that cannot be in heaven if heaven is going to be heaven. It's something that must be atoned for. It's something that can only be banished away from God's presence to hell itself. For God, sin is not just a momentary action. Because He lives in a dimension of eternity outside of time. Because He lives in a dimension we can never understand or comprehend in this life. Of course, His descriptions of the next life are going to seem odd. And of course, His reaction towards sin are going to seem a little bit extreme. It's like, God, why would you take that seriously? It's because He sees it from an eternal perspective with a clarity and a resolution and an insight that we can't even comprehend. Yet for God to make heaven a real place, if it's going to be good for eternity, it can have no trace of evil. It must be holy. There must be no sin there. This is why heaven and hell exist. Heaven is a real place that is better than we can imagine. And hell is a real place that is worse than we can imagine. Heaven will make the best of life look like squalor and shame. Hell will make the worst of this earth look like the best thing that we could possibly imagine. So what do we take away from this? Listen, as you leave, I want you to know that heaven and hell are real. I want you to leave feeling an urgency for heaven. I want us to live preaching the message of Jesus urgently. In the midst of all of this, God knew that no human could get to heaven on their own, right? He wanted to make a place for heaven, but He knew that because we're sinful by nature, we can't be in heaven, not eternally, and have it be good. So God made a way for us. In John 3:16, it says, "For this is how God loved the world. He gave His one and only Son, so that everyone who believes in Him will not be separated from God because of their sin, but will be able to be with God in His presence in heaven." As a person, that is so motivating to me, to know that God loved me that much, that He wanted to make a place for me to go and be with Him where there is only good and no evil. And He wanted to make a way for me to deal with the evil in my life so I could truly be with Him and enjoy His good. That makes so much more sense to me. 1 Corinthians 2:9 says, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, and no mind has imagined what God has prepared for those who love Him." We can't describe what heaven and hell will be like exactly, but we know that God is real. We know that something doesn't come from nothing. And I know some of you might not be that religious watching this, but I want to just challenge you. Like, this is real. We have to have answers for this. We know that tens of thousands of documented near-death experiences corroborate the biblical description of heaven and hell. What's our answer for this? So one advantage of church today is that you guys are sitting in life groups in your home right now. I mean, if you're watching this by yourself with people, like, you're ready to discuss, you're ready to think, you're ready to process this. You know, when we have our live services, we like to end with the music so that we can worship God in that capacity, thinking about what we've learned. But today, I want to challenge you to have a legitimate discussion. Like with your watch parties, maybe online, maybe in your house, in your living room, with your kids, with your family. I want to challenge you to actually have a discussion. If you need to pause the talk as I go through these questions, you go ahead and do that. But I want to give you 5 simple questions that might jog your discussion and hopefully apply some of this talk to your life. First question, what is one point that stuck out to you in today's message? Why? Even if you don't believe in God, you can come up with one point like, hey, that was really interesting, you know? That thing stuck out to me. 2, do you believe in heaven and hell? Why? Let's at least just get open about where we're at with this. Like, let's get open about, man, this is who Jesus is to me. This is who He isn't. Like, I think that's helpful. You know, I think for you to model a little bit of vulnerability with your family, maybe get real with your friends and say, hey, I'm not sure where I'm at. Like, that would be helpful to at least admit, I don't know what I believe, right? Because the first step to learning in faith is admitting where you're at. Number 3, what about heaven excites you? And again, you can answer this even if you're not a Christian. What thought about heaven? If that were a real place, what about it would most excite you? Number 4, how does hell and heaven being real change the way you live and change the way you treat others? For me in particular, I find this really convicting. You know, when I became a Christian, I started thinking about the ways that I treated people like Jeff, like I talked about, Jeff Keenan. I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, these are people who will be with us in eternity. The way that I get angry at people in traffic, the way that I get frustrated with coworkers or with my children or with my wife sometimes, I thought, man, they're going to see this in eternity. God doesn't just see this now. He sees the way that I'm shaping and impacting them forever. Man, what a call to a higher standard because eternity is real. Number 5, how will the way you live this week change because of this message? And I want to challenge everybody, no matter what you believe, to think, man, here's one thing that I learned that's going to change the way that I live this week. Hey, I just ask you to have a prayer with me as we close. Jesus, I lift up all the families and individuals, people, friends who are watching this right now. Lord, I ask that you would bless the discussions we're about to have. I pray that we could live with a deeper and greater intentionality because heaven and hell are real. I thank you that you have promised us more than we could ask for or imagine in Jesus Christ. And I pray that because of this message, people in this community would choose to live in a way that honors your work in our life. Choose to live in a way that follows your teaching, your plan, and your purpose. And I pray that people would receive your grace as the only way to heaven. Thank you for who you are and what you've done for us. In the name of Jesus, all God's people said, amen. Well, thanks so much for tuning in with us. I want to ask everybody to put their hands in, team on three, hands in, team on three. 1, 2, 3, team!